The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
This is sort of depressing, but you know that the Trumpists will just write it off as fake news. There's this thing called Human Rights Watch. Human Rights Watch puts together yearly reports about lack of press freedoms and slavery and indentured servitude and access to fair justice systems, basically an overall assessment of human rights around the world. And Human Rights Watch is pointing to Donald Trump as a negative influence on oppression, the state of oppression around the world, saying that Donald Trump is encouraging it. How is he encouraging it? Well, number one, by his admiration to strongman leaders. We've talked about Rodrigo Duterte. Yeah. We've talked about Vladimir Putin. We've talked about President Erdogan of Turkey. We've talked about, even in the context of very critical comments about Kim Jong-un, some level of admiration for what Kim Jong-un has been, quote, able to do. What other ones are there?
Those are the major ones.
Those are the main four, right? Yeah. So that's number one. Trump sort of has expressed admiration for these strongman leaders and dictators around the world. Trump has completely, quote, broken taboos against racism and xenophobia. That's an interesting way of saying it, which is it doesn't matter whether Trump himself is racist or xenophobic. His presence has broken a lot of the taboos around those issues, taboos that we would argue are good taboos, taboos that we want to have. And that's what has emboldened a lot of these alt-right white supremacist types.
I think that is the best way to say it, too, because it's hard to pick apart whether or not any of Trump's comments are definitively racist or not.
Or at least in terms of his personal views, right?
Right. I mean, even with this latest shithole countries thing, you can argue he's talking about the governments, you know, the land and economies for where these people are from, but not actually the people themselves.
Yeah, that's a very charitable interpretation, but I know what you're saying. Yeah. Hypothetically, that's possible, but what's not deniable, what's without question, is that it definitely is making it so that those who really strictly adhere to those ideas are significantly emboldened. And this report, how can we disagree with this report? We have seen, I don't think it's fair to say the rise of the far right in Europe is because of Donald Trump, but I think what we can say is that Donald Trump is part of the movement that we've seen that has emboldened the far right, both in the United States and in Europe. And we can point to other elected officials in Europe as well.
Yeah, and what about the attacks on the free press, too? I mean, it's not like he's going out and arresting journalists or anything like this, but he's certainly trying to belie their credibility.
Yeah, and that's actually an issue that Human Rights Watch looks at. When Human Rights Watch, and by the way, I want to be super clear, I don't believe Human Rights Watch is some panacea or the ultimate authority to evaluate the state of human rights in different countries, but they do a good job with a lot of these elements. They look at press freedom as well, and when you have low press freedom, that is a negative influence on human rights overall. And Donald Trump has been talking about tightening up libel laws and about this person should be in jail or this shouldn't be allowed. You shouldn't be allowed to cite an anonymous source, and this long list of press freedom negative comments.
Yeah, and it's not like Trump is in the same league as Erdogan or Putin,
of course not.
I don't think. But because the United States is so large and influential, and because Trump is such a different leader than past presidents were, than Bush and Obama were, I think you have to put him at a negative, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, and I would even say that because of the power of the position of President of the United States, Trump doesn't have to be as bad as Duterte to have as much negative influence as Duterte has overall, because the position is one of such significant power.
You know, and I'm sure they could come up with counter arguments, like they've been critical of Iran's regime or Cambodia's regime or North Korea. But overall, you have to see it as a net negative, I think.
No doubt about it. The U.S. ambassador to Panama has resigned from his post on principle because of Donald Trump. He wrote in a resignation letter to the State Department that he can no longer serve the Trump administration. He is going to retire for personal reasons as of the 9th of March this year. I'm talking about John Feely, who has been the ambassador to Panama. And he wrote, as a junior Foreign Service officer, I signed an oath to serve faithfully the president and his administration in an apolitical fashion, even when I might not agree with certain policies. My instructors made clear that if I believed I could not do that, I would be honor-bound to resign. That time has come. And apparently the trigger was the shithole countries comment, which I guess Panama, in the mind, if we are to interpret Trump's analysis of what a shithole country is, if we can even call it an analysis, we have to assume Panama is one, right?
I don't know. I mean, Panama was a U.S. creation. Maybe they are not one of those shithole countries because that was one of our offspring.
I tend to agree only in the sense that Panama has the Panama Canal, and the business connections to that make it a very different beast than lots of the other Central American countries. There's no way Trump knows that, though, right? So I guess what I mean is, in Trump's conception or image or caricature of what a shithole country is, we have to assume that if he was aware of Panama, it would be on his list, right?
Are you surprised that this was the trigger point for this ambassador, though? Because it seems like I think Trump has said a lot worse thus far in his presidency, especially during the campaign. But maybe this hits home a little bit more.
I think there's two things.
The Charlottesville stuff was bad.
Yeah.
And probably worse.
I agree.
Related to exactly the work that he does day to day, maybe he sees this as worse?
I think there's two things. One is, yes, maybe because this is the ambassador to Panama, he felt that Donald Trump was specifically criticizing Panama with his comment. There's one other thing, though, and I'm reminded of the Sean Spicer resignation. Sean Spicer said that the reason he was resigning was, I think, the hiring of Anthony Scaramucci, right? Is that what he said? And none of us really believed it. We thought, well, it might serve as a good reason that he can use, or it might be, it might have been the straw that broke the camel's back. But the idea that that's the sole reason why Spicer resigned doesn't make sense.
No.
I think a similar analysis applies here to the ambassador from Panama.
Yeah, I mean, I wonder if Trump will ever get around to filling his
that
spot,
role. Yeah,
right? I mean, I think the president says that like it doesn't even matter who the ambassadors are because like he at the end of the day is making the decisions.
Yep.
And I mean that just undermines the State Department entirely. It's like their work is not even worth it.
It undermines the State Department, and it sort of throws into the trash the concept of diplomacy, right? I mean, because it's not just about the world is waiting for Trump. A lot of it is what's done behind the scenes. And if Trump has this idea that as president, all that matters is his public statements and his decisions, it's an incredibly ignorant perspective because it's actually the diplomats in many cases that are doing the work on the ground and getting things done.
Yeah, he sees himself as the deal maker who signs off on things. And, you know, to some extent that's true. That's what the president does.
Yeah.
But if you want to lead up to a deal or even just have day-to-day relations, it's the people on the ground who focus their entire lives on that.
Let's talk about where to smoke pot in Colorado. Colorado has legalized recreational cannabis, but there's a problem, which is that in most places, in all places really, indoors, you can't just light up in the same way that you can't just light up a cigarette. So there's a bar in Colorado, a coffee shop rather, that is looking at allowing people to smoke pot inside. I think that this is interesting in terms of what it says about the normalization of recreational cannabis, but without having any commentary about the legality of it, I have no interest in hanging out in a coffee shop where smoking pot is legal any more than I have an interest in hanging out in a coffee shop where smoking cigarettes is legal.
Right.
Not for me. No doubt about it.
But you think it should be legal and exist, I guess, right?
Of course.
I mean, they already have cigar bars and hookah bars and that sort of thing.
If a place says we want to allow smoking inside, I guess they should be able to do it, except I think it's good that restaurants are not allowed to have smoking inside. So I think I'm kind of conflicted in that way. On the one hand, I agree with the legality, but I don't think it's crazy for a city or state government to say no smoking at indoor retail establishments. Now, the way to get around it would be a lot of those cigar bars are clubs, so you need to have a membership. And once it's a membership organization, even if the membership is $2, then you're exempt from those rules of indoor smoking, at least in some states, cities and states. I don't know what's being proposed here, because if the cafe is open to the public, it might actually be violating the no indoor smoking policies. So they might have to make it some kind of membership organization or something.
You never really know. I mean, maybe these smoking policies have specifically to do with cigarettes and tobacco, right? And
it depends on how it's
written.
It depends on how it's written. But we will see what happens at the coffee joint. The coffee joint is going to allow the consumption of pot edibles and the usage of marijuana vape pens. So it's not going to be full-blown smoking.
Ooh.
And technically, I mean, obviously the consumption of edibles is not smoking. And I guess that the vaping, the handheld pens, even for tobacco, are allowed inside because
Right.
they're not considered to be cigarettes or something along those lines. I think this is interesting. I think there's a lot of stuff to be worked out around this, but I have no interest in being around any smoke. That I
No.
can assure you.
Well, here's a question. I mean, do you think it should be legal for someone to just smoke outside in the open, right? Because
I think so.
The problem that people are having is, marijuana becomes legal, but then they have to do it inside their own house, and maybe they have small children who live with them, or
Yep.
they're renting and their landlord may not allow it. You can't just go outside in public and toke up, right? But should there be some restricted areas where you can and can't?
My instinct is that if marijuana is legal in the way that cigarettes are legal, if you can smoke cigarettes in open spaces, you should be able to smoke pot in open spaces. Now, the counter argument is not all of these drugs are regulated equally, because in a lot of places where you can smoke cigarettes outdoors, there are open container laws and you're not allowed to walk around outside drinking alcohol. So there is a legal precedent for making a distinction. And the truth is, I think that just completely open and legal outdoor drinking probably does increase the amount of drunk driving, even though I enjoy and have been to many places where you're allowed to be out on the street with a drink. So I don't have, a lot of times people like to come up with some overarching principle that they then can apply to all of these situations. If it's legal recreationally, it should be legal anywhere as long as the person is not under the influence to a degree that they're harassing people or committing crimes. And then they would apply that to cigarettes, pot, and alcohol. I don't have some particular umbrella principle that I would apply to all these situations, and I've not really formed a solid opinion.
And you really can't even compare cigarette smoke to marijuana smoke, too, because I think the worst thing that would happen if you're walking by a cigarette smoker is just smells bad for a few seconds.
Well, secondhand smoke causes cancer.
Yeah, but I mean, if you're just going, just walking by them, right?
But cumulatively, walking by a lot of people smoking, I don't know that I agree with that. There's a lot of bad repercussions.
What I was going to get to was that if you walk by someone smoking marijuana, then you could get high, right? You can get secondhand high potentially.
You could, but I think that the same thing applies in terms of ingesting breathing in smoke is bad for your lungs and it can cause lung cancer, and that applies to whether you're smoking cigarettes, marijuana, or banana leaf. So I think that there we do need to have some overarching principle. Either there's no smoking of anything in public because of the health effects, or you've got to allow both pot and cigarettes. I don't know, but I think that the smoking is bad for the lungs no matter what it is that you are smoking.
Sure. I think there's a difference between being outside on the sidewalk versus being out in the forest on a hike, though. I guess it just has to do with how many people are around you, right?
Yes.
Because I don't see anything wrong or unethical, especially if it's legal, with someone smoking marijuana while on a hike.
Certainly not.
Out in the wilderness. But
for me, it's
if
not
you're
an
out,
issue.
in a busy office area, then I can see you just can't do that.
There are office buildings that now have passed laws that say, there are office buildings that have put up signs, and there have been some laws passed in central business districts and cities that say no smoking within X number of feet of the front door of commercial buildings, for example, or something like that. And there are attempts to do that. I just don't know if more regulation of that kind is the answer. I'm really at a loss. I don't know what it is that I think should happen on this.
I'm just surprised you're for the open container ban. It sounds like.
I'm not necessarily for it. I guess I'm pointing out that there's a precedent for this type of thing, and I don't know what standards should be applied. I enjoy being able to be somewhere and having a drink and being able to walk around. It's common in a lot of beach places. It's common in Vegas, for example, in all of Europe. The thing is, I don't know that Americans can handle it the way that they handle it in Europe.
It's always just funny to me when you're at a restaurant in the outdoor patio section, and of course alcohol is allowed there.
Right.
But if you go outside of that fence, then you're breaking the law.
Then it's
That's
illegal.
ridiculous.
It's absolutely insane, no doubt. All right, that's it for today. We'll talk to you on Monday.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.